On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Brooklyn-based journalist and author Sharon Lerner, and on her piece, DuPont and the Chemistry of Deception in The Intercept, which I believe is partially done in conjunction with the Nation Investigative Journalism Fund. Welcome to the program, Sharon.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's the Investigative Fund. Yep.
And let me just, I should say, just as a full disclosure, as I was reading your piece, much of this I was at least somewhat familiar with because I do a radio program with Mike Papantonio, who not only did he and Bobby Kennedy working on a deal, I should say a case against DuPont, win a $381 million settlement in Spelter, West Virginia, on dealing with a zinc smeltering plant. But I believe that firm is also working on the C8 cases, the Teflon cases that are coming out, as you write, in September. And just as a matter of full disclosure, I don't know much more other than I think an interview I've done on this program maybe a year or two ago about this topic. But I just wanted to get that out there because your story it really is stunning. I mean, I read stories like this, and it just I don't like to swear on air, and I won't. But it makes me wonder what in the world is wrong with people when you read something like this. Tell us. You start with the story of a guy named Ken Wamsley. Just tell us about Ken Wamsley's situation right now.
Sure. Well, Ken Wamsley is a former DuPont employee. He lives in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And he used to be a lab analyst there in what was called the Teflon division. And he worked, had some exposure to this chemical through his work. And he developed a disease called ulcerative colitis. That condition, which is like a bowel disease, sometimes leads to rectal cancer, and which is what happened for him. And so I interviewed him about his work at DuPont and also his condition now. He's pretty ill. And then, I kind of led the story with him because, one, the cases that you've been talking about are a bunch of personal injury cases. There are about 3,500 or so that are coming up, the first of them, as you mentioned, in September. And these are cases that are coming out of this class action suit in West Virginia that involved people who lived near the DuPont plant there in Parkersburg. And it's basically people who lived in these water districts that had a significant amount of this chemical C8 we've been talking about. And so the people who lived in this water district who had this stuff in their water, if they developed any of 6 conditions that a group of scientists determined were linked to the chemical, then they would be allowed to sue. And so these are the cases that are coming up now. There are people who we know were exposed to a certain level of this chemical who developed any of these 6 conditions, and it's ulcerative colitis, preeclampsia, kidney cancer, testicular cancer. There are a couple others. So he's one of those people, and the reason I led with him is because I feel like in these completely overwhelming legal messes that, with lots of acronyms and chemical names and companies involved and complicated laws, everything. It's just complete tangle of, words and institutions and all this. It really comes down to cases like this, people, and you want to think about why do any of us care about any of this? And I think whether it's Ken Wamsley or someone else, we care because ultimately these chemicals have the power to hurt us. And, what does that look like? Well, for Ken Walmsley, it looks like being very restricted in his movements. He can't, he doesn't go out much anymore. He has a colostomy bag. He can't sleep well, and it's just one person, but it's a way of understanding what potentially, chemicals, what they can do and how they could affect everyone.
I have to say, I know someone who has ulcerative colitis. It is an incredibly difficult disease, particularly when you have it as acutely as Ken Walmsley seems to have. But what your story also tells for me, and we're gonna basically go to the beginning of it. But what your story also relates to me is that Ken Walmsley is, in many respects, and people like him may very well be the sort of the canaries in the coal mine on one level in terms of the health implications of this. It also strikes me as what this story really tells is it really lifts the veil on this notion of just what people are capable of doing when they feel they are in some way shrouded or, I guess, at arm's length because of a veil of being part of a company or a corporation. But before we get to those parts of it, because some of that element, it comes out in the course of, I guess, the discovery in these personal injury cases. Tell us what C8 is. And I should warn people at home, be prepared to be disturbed because you all have had these products in your house. And you're going to find out that you've had them, that you have it in your blood too. What is C8?
So C8 is a processing aid. It's a chemical that's used in the production of Teflon, and that's kind of what it's famous for. In fact, though, it's used in thousands of products. And the exposure, you're right, that we all have it, 99.7% of Americans have some level of this in their blood, according to the latest figures I've seen from the CDC. So it is a man-made chemical. It didn't exist before it was created years ago. So, and it's been on the market since, I believe, the early 1950s. So we know that it's in our blood because it was created and produced and put into the environment and absorbed by us in various ways. I should say, though, that Teflon is not the major source of exposure. I don't think people fully understand why it's in everyone. I should say that. But they know, and also it's not just in humans and in breast milk and in umbilical cord blood, and it's also in animals, wildlife, and it's also in ocean waters, and it's also in many places throughout the world. But, so we don't fully understand it. It is, I think, at least in part due to exposure to products, but I think that we know that the biggest source, bigger than Teflon, is stain repellent coating for carpets. There's Stainmaster. There are other. It's also in Scotchgard and similar chemicals in Gore-Tex and sort of water repellent fabrics, all that kind of stuff. So people do think that is one of the ways that we get it into our blood. And I personally have tossed my Teflon pans. I think it's the judgment call, but I think. Again, it's not the number one source of exposure, we think.
So we have this. We know it's all of this exposure, though, leads to the development of this C8 because it doesn't occur in nature, and so it's everywhere. Tell us what is, and at the time that this was introduced. Back in the 40s, the late 40s, early 50s. What is the process? I mean, I develop a chemical like this. How rigorous is the federally mandated at least in the United States, the mandated testing to see if this this product is safe, and how much of it is sort of government oversight in terms of testing this, or simply we're going to trust a corporation, in this case DuPont, to tell us what they've found?
Well, I mean, when they introduced the chemical, it was perfectly legal to do it without, knowing what its health consequences are, and that's still largely the case. The way we do things here, essentially, in short, is to assume, sort of innocent till proven guilty for chemicals. That is not the way things are done in Europe. What we do say is, what the EPA says is, you are obligated to report any evidence you have that it might be harmful, and it doesn't have to be conclusive. It can just be suggestive. You need to do that. But it's very hard for them to make sure that people are doing that, because you have to submit, your evidence if you have it. So if you get busted for not doing that, you can get in trouble. And that's in fact what happened with DuPont. In 2005, I believe they were fined it was the biggest fine in EPA history at the time. And they were fined for withholding some evidence that, C8 was harmful to animals, and also, actually some of that, and that they knew that it had spread beyond the plant. There are a couple of things that they were being fined for, but it's worth noting that the fine, it was pretty small compared to their profits. So it's not a great deterrent. It doesn't really work that well.
Right. I mean, it is essentially, when you look at the fine in terms of their operating expenses, it's equivalent to keeping a couple of lights on in one of their factories. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's simply it's baked into the cake. We have operating expenses, and one of them is labor and scientists and facilities, and one is the fine, apparently, that we have a sense that we're ultimately going to pay. So let's talk about how these companies, the most obvious way a company would figure out that their chemical has the potential of being dangerous to the population at large is that there is hints that it may be dangerous to people who are working with it on a daily basis, right? Because these are the people who are coming into contact with it the most. And so let's go back to when, through discovery, I guess, the process of legal discovery, which is the sort of the, I don't know if I would call it the prologue, but of a civil litigation, but it is the first process where essentially the company has to release all its documents, and a law firm goes in there and sort of forensically checks all of the documents the company has in terms of internal communications. And you write, through this process of legal discovery, DuPont employees for many years, there are hundreds of internal communications revealing that DuPont employees for many years suspected that C8 was harmful, yet continued to use it. Give us a sense of when those first internal documents start to reveal that there was concern amongst DuPont employees and management that C8 was potentially toxic to human beings.
Well, it was certainly a gradual process. There is a note in 1954 about this possible toxicity, and it's sort of from then built. I should say that their experiments were, for the most part, they were looking at health effects in lab animals. They looked at the toxicity to the livers of dogs and rats, a lot of experiments on rats. And ultimately, they were also observing effects in their workers. And they did see that the chemical accumulated in their livers and sometimes caused workers to have abnormal liver function tests, and there was some internal dispute as to whether or not that was in fact a health effect. And because, they kind of reasoned that it wasn't exactly a health effect, that was part of their rationale for not reporting the abnormal liver stuff to the EPA at the time.
Now, has the EPA
also?
Let me ask you this, Sharon. If I could, has the EPA made a determination as to whether or not their analysis that this abnormal liver function that they perceived as a result of C8 but did not perceive as to be a health effect, has the EPA made any type of, ruling or judgment as to whether or not that type of liver dysfunction qualifies as at least sort of prima facie or enough evidence to report to the FDA? I mean, to the FDA or to the...
Yeah, I don't know specifically what they've said about the liver stuff. I know that they're very clear that they, even if it's not conclusive, that they want you to report it if it's suggestive of harm. So I would assume that would fall under that. But I just wanted to say that I'm not sure you realize that the piece that you read that's in the Intercept now is the first of 3. So this will be a series continuing through next week. So this is the first piece, and the second and third piece will go obviously into greater detail. Both about regulation, but about, we've been talking a little bit about internal documents, and that certainly will be a big part of what's to come.
Well, give us a little bit of a glimpse into what we're going to see in those pieces as well, as if you will, because you talk about the history of DuPont. They had a little bit of an issue with leaded gasoline. Is my understanding. Walk us through that and the industrial chemicals.
It's a huge company. It began in, I can't remember the exact date, but 19th century, as the manufacturer of gunpowder and explosives, and that's how they got their start. They did manufacture the leaded gasoline, which no longer in the market. They've actually had a number of kind of environmentally potent kind of explosive products. One was leaded gasoline, which did cause mental illness in some of the workers who worked with it. They worked with some rubber additives or something that were turning workers blue, but they recovered, but they turned blue. They worked with Freon. They had involvement with the Manhattan Project. So they're a huge company, and they're they've worked with pesticides. They deal with things that are potent and sometimes dangerous, and they've had lots of as a consequence, it can be a dirty business. So what they did, to their credit, was they were the first company that I've been able to find that came up with an in-house toxicology unit, this laboratory called Haskell Labs, that they tasked with checking out the safety of their products, both for workers and people who would buy them, and to see if the chemicals that they were making and using had health effects. So they were proactive in that way and set up Haskell Labs. But the problem is, I think this is the problem. This was a problem back when they set up the lab in 1935, and it's still a problem that, there's just inherent conflicts when you are studying your own products. The decisions that you make and the research that you do has an impact on your bottom line. And, DuPont's a public company. They have, by law, obligations to their shareholders, and these things end up coming in conflict. And I think that's what we're looking at. That, on the one hand, a company needs to make money, and on the other, there are real liabilities that come along with a business like chemicals. And so I think they throughout their history have been wrestling with this.
Well, I mean, just quoting from your piece, one of Haskell's first employees, a pathologist named Wilhelm Hooper, cracked the bladder cancer case that DuPont was looking at in terms of bladder cancers that were cropping up amongst many of their dye workers. And he cracked this case by developing a model of how the dye chemicals led to the disease, but the company forbade him from publishing some of his research. And according to public health scholar David Michaels, fired him in 1937 before going on to use the chemical in question for decades more after the fact.
Right. So, and you mentioned it, but I should, add that that's obviously David Michaels' research. He wrote a wonderful book called Doubt is Their Product, which was about different consulting companies that kind of are in different ways that people, companies and their consultants spin scientific information and, to help them continue to profit. And he used this as an example, which I thought was a great one.
And then you write, in 1954, a DuPont employee named R.A. Dixon noted that he had received an inquiry regarding C8's possible toxicity, and within 7 or 8 years later, they already determined that this was a chemical that needed to be handled with extreme care, which in and of itself, I guess, is not, atypical. I would imagine you want to do that for most chemicals. But this is the beginning of them, sort of this process of, it seems to me, DuPont employees, some of them, finding like a thread, if you will, and saying, hey, you know what? This is a thread that looks like we should pull on. And then basically DuPont, as a corporation, says, no, we're not going to pull on that. In fact, let's just snip it right here and continue on with this product.
Well, sure. I mean, there are lots of decisions, you make about, right. Are you going to pursue something that could be damning? Probably not. But in some cases, there are judgment calls throughout this. And I would say that some within the company, it's a huge company. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of divisions. They have legal. They have they have the lab, they have all, the people doing the engineering, the development, the lab analysts, whatever. So, there was a variety of opinions within the company, and it's interesting to read about that. As I've been reading through all these documents, what a company does in the end doesn't always reflect all the people within the company. So there were people who were saying, hey, let's do this, look out, is this dangerous, and who believed they were doing the right thing. But in the end, it's a huge conglomerate that, makes complicated decisions based on a lot of input.
And, and I want to get to that. Let's touch on that. Like, how, I have no doubt that when you have a company that size, I mean, heck, even a company the size of the one that I have to make this podcast, radio program, there's often dissent. But ultimately, how do we define what is the company? Or is that part of the problem? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Is it
right.
Where is
yes.
what is it that the company is doing, and what do we mean when we say that? Because you also write that because of its toxicity, C8 disposal presented a problem. In the 60s, the company buried 200 drums of the chemical on the banks of the Ohio River near the plant. And then you found an internal DuPont document from 1975 about Teflon waste disposal, which detailed how the company began packing the waste in drums, shipping the drums out on barges out to sea, and dumping them in the ocean, adding stones to make the drums sink. This is,
Right. And the thing, to note, so ocean dumping at the time in the 60s was legal. And so, what they were doing, we don't know exactly how much of this stuff they disposed of this way, but basically they realized, this is a little bit too toxic to put in the town dump or whatever. We are going to dump it directly into the ocean. And at the time, until 1972, there was a Ocean Dumping Act or something that made it illegal. And so until then, they were dumping it right directly into the ocean.
But let me ask you this. If I am aware that something is too toxic to dump here near me, and I want to go out into the ocean to dump it, does that not cross the threshold where I should be informing either the EPA or the FDA, EPA not at that time, obviously, the FDA, that, hey, this thing is at least toxic enough that we feel like we should be dumping it in the middle of the ocean?
Seems like a problem. I agree. That's why I put it in there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just curious because, this is...
Do I think you would like... No, that's why I put it in there.
Right.
Yeah, ocean dumping huge amounts of a toxic chemical in the ocean. Good idea. Not to me. But, legal, yes.
But legal to dump it. But, I mean, do you have a sense of whether or not that's indicative of enough awareness of the toxicity levels to report that under the FDA threshold?
Well, it wasn't an FDA threshold. It's an EPA threshold. And no, I don't think they were obligated to report it.
Okay. Interesting. And so as we move forward, in 1978, DuPont alerted its workers to the results of a study done by 3M showing that employees were accumulating C8 in their blood. At what point did DuPont decide we should not be exposing pregnant women who work for us to this?
Right. So that was after the 3M study came out. So 3M did this study with rats and came up with that rats who were exposed to the chemical were more likely to have pups that were that had facial deformities, and so they, later there was some dispute as to whether or not the results of that experiment were valid. I think that whether or not they were valid, the company 3M went to the EPA and explained the study and told them, reported the results that they're obligated to do. And at the time, DuPont also had some interaction with the EPA and discussed the results of the study. I can't remember if it was in person or through letters, but what happened was they also realized that it would be wise to look at their own exposed workers, pregnant women who were exposed, and found that one or possibly two of them out of a group of 10, it was somewhere between 8 and 10 women who were pregnant. There were one and possibly two babies that had facial deformities as well. And so that was evidence that they also had evidence because they, at the time, took blood from the babies and from the workers, and they realized that there was this chemical in both the mothers and in the newborn babies. So in doing that, they had the first evidence that C8 crossed the placental barrier in humans. And so that was kind of a huge discovery, but that was what they did not report to the EPA and what they ended up getting fined about. One of the things they ended up getting fined over later in 2005.
And they did basically, after finding that there was a 1 in 4, 1 in 5, I mean, I guess 2 out of 8 or 2 out of 10 chance of deformities with a child from a pregnant woman exposed to that stuff. They did basically say no more pregnant women working in this division. And
yes,
that's what takes us back to Ken Wamsley.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, he comes back. He ends up working in that division.
He worked in the lab.
And didn't he say at one point in your piece, he said, I asked, hey, what's going on with the pregnant women that you're moving out of this division? Is it okay for us to be here?
Yes. And he said that they said it won't hurt the men. That's right.
And so flash forward to us. How is it that it came out in 2005? I mean, how did this stuff? How was it that the EPA ultimately end up providing a fine for DuPont for not reporting in the way that they should have reported?
Well, the information about all of this, about really the vast majority of all this that we're talking about, was brought to the EPA and to other agencies by an attorney named Robert Bilott, who was representing some people who were exposed in West Virginia. And at the time, he was also representing a farmer whose cows had been exposed and died. The farmer had leased or sold part of his land to DuPont, and so their property was adjacent to his. They dumped some of the chemical onto the property, and afterward, the farmer, whose name was Tennant, his cows died. And so Bilott represented Tennant, and they sued DuPont, and DuPont settled with them. But in the process of their suing, and then Bilott ended up representing a whole group, which became a class of people in the area who were exposed to their drinking water. It was his litigation that turned up all these documents.
So,
and he's also presiding over the class, the suits that are upcoming in September.
Interesting. And so, your next two pieces, just give us a little bit of a preview. You did slightly already, but give us a little more of a preview of those two pieces, and people can check them out, obviously, at The Intercept.
Okay. So the second one will be all about sort of the lawsuits and the very strange process that that led to, uncovering all this that we've been talking about, and sort of this dawning realization among the local communities that they've been exposed. And then the third one is all about regulators and how this went down, and really is, in a way, continuing to go down in terms of, how to figure out what's safe and what's not safe now that it's out kind of in a widespread way.
Is in the course of reporting on this, I mean, did you develop an opinion as to what would be a better system, or what is the fundamental problem, I guess, we have, that for half a century, a company can put out and work with a chemical that they know to some degree or another is either, they know it's either toxic or they know it is potentially toxic, enough so that there should be more research, but they're not going forward with it. And at one point...
I would say that, the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, is, up for reauthorization and has been for a while, and people are debating it. And that is at the center of this problem, because essentially we've grandfathered in. We've just, I was saying that when DuPont introduced the chemical, it's perfectly legal to do that because we weren't at all regulating chemicals. I mean, since then we have TSCA. But what it said that there were tens of thousands of existing chemicals that were in existence when the law passed, that they were just done. And then, so that there wasn't anything particular that was going to be done to these chemicals that were already in existence, and that the ones, again, with the ones that are being introduced, the burden is still on regulators to show that they're unsafe, instead of placing the burden, as Europe does, on the users and manufacturers to show that they're safe before they start using and manufacturing them. So to flip it in that way, I think would go a long way to solving the problem.
With those existing chemicals, does the company have any responsibility to go back and basically say, hey, here's a study that we had from 1955, let's say, that indicated or that basically should have set off a red flag and said more study is warranted? Do they have any obligation under existing law to do that, or can they just basically ignore it?
they have an obligation under existing law. Yeah, no, I mean there are huge fixes, and as I mentioned before, the problem of the the companies, are also bound in this way to be responsible to their stockholders, sort of within the limits of the law. And I think that what the lawyers, the attorneys that are about to go forward on these cases would say is that they weren't within the limits of the law, and we'll see if they win on that. But whether or not they were within the limits of the law allows far too much, in terms of, different ways to get around the, weak regulations that already, that we have. So I feel like there's a lot of room for improvement, and I feel like it's a great moment to think about the TSCA reauthorization, and also to think about, as consumers, I mean, the other thing that we can do is, exert real pressure on companies, to figure out what they're doing, but two, to say, if you are doing this, we will not buy your stuff, or, or conversely, a company that makes the concerted effort not to use these chemicals and to see if they're, to make products that don't contain these kinds of things, to say, what, we will, we'll follow you where you go. This matters to us. So I think that part of the process is going, trying to understand what's happened, and what's happening all around us is not just, the only chemical in, this is one of many chemicals.
Right.
And so to say, try to get a better handle on what's in the environment around us, and then through all the various ways, in terms of the law and in terms of using our powers as consumers, to exert our, our opinion that it's not okay, and that we will do what we can to make sure that we're not exposed to them.
Indeed. Well, I'm a little skeptical about the power of a consumer to react to something that is now in all our bloods. But
it's not all that. It's not all. It's not all that. We need to do much more. But given that the limits of we should have done better with TSCA in the first place.
Right.
Reauthorized a better bill a long time
Right.
ago. All that is true. At the same time, given the state of Congress, it's not going to look the way we want it to look.
Indeed.
I think you know that. So you do what you can.
Indeed. Sharon Lerner, the piece is DuPont and the Chemistry of Deception, the first of three in a series at The Intercept. We will link to it at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Okay,
Bye-bye.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.